Okay, um, good evening, everyone, to those who are joining us from around the world, and welcome to this fantastic event this evening. My name is Zinzan Gurney, and I'll be your chair for the next hour. The format of today's event will be in two portions. The first portion will be a 30-minute talk given by our speaker, who I'll introduce shortly. And the second portion will be a question and answer session in which you can post questions via the Zoom Q&A function. Just to reiterate for those who didn't hear, we will not be submitting questions via the chat. You have to look at the Q&A feature and you'll be able to submit anonymous questions there. And then during the Q&A session, the second portion, I'll be able to ask these questions to our speaker. So the topic of tonight's event is post-COVID recovery and the future of global economics. And we'll be examining the immediate challenge of economic recovery from COVID-19, as well as discuss measures to overhaul our system of global economic governance and propel us on a path towards a sustainable and equitable future. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros, who is a Cambridge alumnus and an international economist with over 30 years of experience at international organizations. Most recently, he was at the World Bank, where he was the director of the Global Economic Indicators Group. And he's also most recently co-authored two books, one of which is called Equality for Women Equals Prosperity for All, and the other book being Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century. This event forms part of the Cambridge University Festival and is being organized by the Cambridge University Baha'i Society. The founding principles of the Baha'i faith include the oneness of humankind, equality between men and women, universal education, and the eradication of the extremes of wealth and poverty. We believe that we are responsible for breaking down barriers of race, class, creed, and nations, and that in time this will lead to the betterment of the world and the advancement of civilization. So with these thoughts in mind, I invite you all to begin asking any questions via the Q&A chat. These will be answered later on in the Q&A portion. And now I'd like to hand it over to our speaker for his talk.
Thank you very much, Zinzan, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be with you today. It's especially meaningful for me that it is the Cambridge Festivals, as I have very fond memories of my stay in Cambridge long ago. I thought that perhaps what I would do is I would begin by giving you a kind of a 1-minute summary of just the seriousness of the crisis that we have seen over the last 12 months, 2020 essentially. You know, we thought that the global financial crisis in 2009 was the most intense economic crisis that we had experienced in a very, very long time. But, you know, it's really interesting. GDP in 2009 contracted by 0.1% for the whole world. The advanced economies contracted sharply, but this was offset by continued growth in the emerging markets and the developing economies. 2020 is a totally different story. The reduction in GDP has been of the order of 5%, and it has been throughout the world. Advanced economies as well as emerging markets and developing economies. You have seen something like 1.6 billion people, mainly working in the informal sector. They have seen their income reduced by somewhere between 60 and 80% because of the lockdown and the shutdown of, you know, most sectors of countries' economies. This has been especially the case in Latin America, but in other countries where the informal sector is very large in relation to the size of the economy. You have seen drying up of capital flows. You have seen a drop in immigrants' remittances, which are a very important source of income for the developing world. Immigrant remittances are now in the neighborhood of $500 billion per year, where last year in 2020, they contracted by something like 20%. Tax revenues have collapsed, exports have collapsed because international trade has been affected. And of course, on the fiscal side, we have seen a very sharp deterioration of budget deficits throughout the world and increases in the burden or the level of public debt as well. roughly twice as large as that what we saw in 2009, which was the worst year of the global financial crisis. So without doubt, this is the worst economic crisis that we have had since the Great Depression of the late 20s and early 1930s. One interesting aspect of this contraction, especially if you go a little bit beyond just the economic data, is that at least in the minds of many scientists, it reflects sort of our aggressive, pervasive invasion into animal habitats, which are linked to population growth. The forecasts are that there will be 9 to 10 billion of us by 2050, and 95% of this growth of population is going to be in urban, densely populated centers. And as we enter into these natural habitats of animals, we come into contact with species that carry viruses against which have no immunity. And so this is a problem that we're going to have to address in some fashion over the longer term. Otherwise, pandemics will continue to come and will continue to assail not only our economy, but our political systems and our social systems. I want to say something about poverty because the impact of the pandemic, as you will see in a couple of minutes, has been really quite dramatic on the poverty side. And to do that, let me just share with you a few numbers. As Zinzan indicated, I was for many years the director of the Global Indicators Group at the World Bank, and the World Bank is the organization in the world that basically compiles data on poverty. And what we know is that depending on the poverty line that you look at, obviously the picture that emerges about poverty, varies. If you use the very austere poverty line of $1.90 of income per person per day, something like 10% of the world's population is extremely poor. That's about 750 million people. But this kind of poverty is degrading and demoralizing. It's such an austere definition of poverty that it's not something that you would wish on your worst enemy. At a somewhat more generous or less austere $3.20 per person per year, something like 25% of the world's population is poor. That's about 2 billion people. And if you use a more reasonable poverty line, which is $5.50, which by the way, still leaves people with this level of income struggling, having difficulties meeting their obligations, something like 50% of the world's population is poor. So we still have an unresolved poverty problem in the world, notwithstanding the progress that has taken place over the last 30 years, mainly because of very feverish growth rates in China. Now, with COVID, however, what has happened is that in 2020, according to the World Bank, we saw an increase of something like 120 million in the numbers of extremely poor people because of COVID. And this number is expected to increase again in 2021 to the tune of something like 40 million people. So I regret to say this, but it seems to me that COVID has made Sustainable Development Goal number 1, the elimination of poverty by 2030, probably something that will be very, very, very difficult to reach. Perhaps it is out of reach altogether, which is very regrettable because this is the one area where, which is at the basis of the Sustainable Development Goal sort of framework. Of course, poverty brings with it malnourishment. We have 820 million people in the world who are malnourished, with all the implications that carries for the rest of people's lives. I won't go into that because time is short, but you know what the implications are of malnourishment. It brings with it illiteracy, and of course it brings with it fragility and conflict as well. So it isn't just that we have large numbers of people with very low incomes, we have all these other social dysfunctions and problems that come with it. We also, of course, have a problem of inequality in the world. The debate on inequality usually centers around, income distribution metrics. So somebody like me will come and tell you to drive the point across that we have a serious problem of in the last 30 years have gone to the top 5% of the population. And I could recite statistics like this, for the next 20 minutes, giving you, different perspectives on how skewed income distribution has become. For me, what is perhaps more interesting is that we live in a world in which there is inequality of opportunity, not just income, but also opportunity. At the World Bank, we have done studies which show very, very clearly that if you're born to a poor family, there is high likelihood that you will be poor later on in life. If you're born to a rich family, likewise, high likelihood that you will be rich in the future life. Think of you being born in Angola and you being born in Norway, and contrast, the implications for that for your future life. If you are born in Angola, you will have lower life expectancy. You may not make it to the age of 1 or 5. You certainly will not have access to the same kind of quality of education that you would if you had been born in Norway. And of course, you will have lower income as well. And so this is something that has impact for future generations as well. And I think that from an ethical, moral perspective, it is a feature of our global economic system, which I think is profoundly unfair. And it is simply not acceptable because we live in a world in which levels of wealth are, at least until 2020, have been at an all-time historical high. So the resources are there, and that we should have an economy that generates vast amounts of income while at the same time has huge amounts of inequality, poverty, and inequality of opportunity, I think is an indictment of our economic system in a very fundamental way. Of course, we also have, as you know, a problem with on the climate change side, which is a feature of today's economy. Climate change is a reflection of the particular economic model that we have had over the last 2 centuries, which has been based on cheap fossil fuels. Here again, it's customary to quote some dramatic statistics or facts, that highlight the extent of climate change. I have one which you may not have heard about, and which I will share with you. I think it's very graphic and very interesting. And it has to do with the melting of the ice. Scientists have done an experiment, and they actually measure the amount of ice that melted over a 24-hour period on August 1st of 2019. The estimates are that during that 24-hour period, 12.5 billion tons of ice melted into the ocean. Now, what is exactly 12.5 billion tons of ice? What does it mean in practice? It's difficult to get a sense unless you happen to be working in this area, which most of us aren't. Well, the scientists have indicated that 12.5 billion tons of melted ice is enough to cover the entire state of Florida in 13 centimeters of water. Now, if you extrapolate, that means that over a 15-day period, you generate about 1.95 meters of water, which is enough to drown me. I am 187, and essentially to drown the vast majority of the population in that state, which is a fairly large state. So this illustrates, I think, in a very dramatic way, what is happening today on the climate change side. We are not going to talk about loss of biodiversity, the impact on agriculture, on food production, and so on. And then let me just finally say that a feature of our system as it exists today is that it also coexists with an enormous amount of gender inequality. At the World Bank, in fact, in one of my teams, we did an accounting of all the kinds of discriminations that are embedded in the laws of 190 countries. And it turns out that we have about 1,600 different forms of discrimination that essentially turn women into second-class citizens. In some countries, it's 1 or 2. In other countries like Iran, it's 23, 24, 25. Different ways, creative ways, imaginative ways in which the government basically turns women into second-class citizens. Now, one question here is, what sort of economic governance do we need then? how should the system change in some way? And this is what I like to do or focus on in the next few minutes. I will focus first on some practical aspects. Time is short, and then I will illustrate 2 or 3 important principles which I think should guide our thinking about the kind of future economics that we want. On the practical side, it seems to me that we need to rethink our entire concept of security. When governments talk about security, when politicians, prime ministers, make a case, for safety and security, typically the debate has, at least thus far, framed in terms of our military establishments. We feel secure if our governments spend a great deal of money providing weaponry and modernizing our air forces and our navies and making sure that our armies are ready to defend the national borders. And I think what COVID-19 has shown is that this kind of thinking is actually very limiting. We need to evolve. The United States has been one of the countries most affected by COVID in 2020. It has thousands of nuclear weapons, and they are completely useless when you are fighting a virus. So maybe security needs to be thought of more in terms of human welfare. Maybe security in the future needs to be framed in terms of the effectiveness of our health systems, the preparedness of our public health systems to withstand an invisible enemy such as a coronavirus. So I think that this is one area where we need to do a huge amount of exploration in the future, and obviously it has economic implications because at the moment we spend so much money on security, on weapons, and on beefing up our military establishments. 193 sovereign members of the United Nations, they all feel that they need to have an army and a navy and an air force and so on, because we don't have a system of collective security. Next, we need to increase the coverage of health insurance and paid sick leave. I think this is obvious. If one segment of the population is not covered, as is the case in the United States, then they're vulnerable. And if people within the population are more vulnerable to the virus, then everybody's at risk. So this is an area in which a sense of solidarity, which means essentially extending social protections to the entire population, it makes sense in terms of the safety and the security of all. This then raises another important question, which is that I think that we need to have a serious rethinking about the spending priorities of our governments. I'm not just talking about security and the military. At the moment, we are spending, according to the IMF, this is one of the best studies that they have done in recent years, we're spending like $5.5 trillion, which is about 6.5% of world GDP, subsidizing energy, gasoline, natural gas, electricity, carbon. These subsidies not only accelerate climate change, but they also make income inequality worse, because 60% of the benefits of the subsidies are concentrated on the top 20% of the population, the top 20 richest percent of the population. So they are an absurd public policy, bad on the environment, bad on equality. Maybe we should spend more money improving the quality of infrastructures. That there are 860 million people in the world who have no access to electricity. And at the World Bank, we've done studies which show that if you have no access to electricity, more likely your children are going to struggle at school. They will be at a disadvantage with respect to children who can study at home and prepare for the next day's lessons. So this is one very important area, and it's especially important because the pandemic last year has shown just how unprepared our public health systems are, how vulnerable and brittle and unstable many of these systems are to deal with a crisis such as we had in 2020. So obviously, how we allocate the resources that we have, how we deploy the revenues collected by the budget for different social and economic ends is a very vital question. And I have no doubt that we're wasting resources on a massive scale. we need to address institutional weaknesses more generally, which manifest themselves in all kinds of problems. You know, climate change is not being solved under existing systems of international cooperation. The Paris Accord, as much of 2015, as much as we celebrate it, because it signals at least a recognition on the part of many, many, many governments that we have a problem, is failing. It's failing. It's not working. Emissions have continued to go up. We have a bit of a blip downwards in 2020 because of the collapse of the global economy, but you can be sure that the recovery in 2021 is going to be robust, and the economy will enter into a period of growth again, and emissions will continue rising, making the goals of the Paris Accord essentially unreachable. So we need to adapt our institutions, the United Nations, its agencies, many of which are quite weighty and powerful, the IMF, the World Bank, many multilateral development banks, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and so on and so forth. You know, they need to be brought up to date. They need to be modernized. You know, Shoghi Effendi, the head of the Baha'i community in the early 1930s, said something which I think is still very relevant today. He said, the fundamental cause of world unrest is our failure to adjust our systems of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age. You know, in 1945, we created a new system of global governance with the creation of the United Nations, but that system has not been modernized, has not adapted to the vast changes that have taken place in the last 75 years as a result of changes in technology and in scientific development and so on. And then we also need to take a kind of a closer look at something that has become less controversial than it used to be in the past, which is universal basic income. I think that the idea of providing a safety net that protects everybody in the world, below which nobody falls, is increasingly making sense. The idea has been somewhat controversial in the past because of issues of affordability. Many governments, many academics, many distinguished scientists have said, yes, this is like a good idea in principle, but we can't afford it. And I have written a blog, which you can see in the website of the Global Governance Forum, which essentially makes the case that we need to have an honest debate about universal basic income. And by honest debate, I mean, we need to look at the entire range of public expenditures. You know, we need to ask ourselves, if we stop subsidizing energy with all the negative collateral effects that it has, well, all of a sudden we have 6.5% of world GNP available potentially as resources which could be deployed for other ends, such as providing a safety net for everybody. To live in a world in which an accident of history, which is the nationality of your parents, and whether you are born in Norway or Burundi, that should be the determining factor for your future, I think is really a travesty. It is a system that is no longer acceptable. And it's not just an issue of ethics, you know, the desire to protect people and eliminate extreme poverty, but it's also an issue of self-protection, because in a pandemic, if somebody falls ill, there is that we will all fall ill. That is the nature of pandemics. That is the nature of the beast that we're dealing with. Let me say a few things in the few minutes that I have left about what I would call principles. I have talked about some practical aspects, things that we need to look at in the future in respect of the kind of economy that we would like to see. It seems to me that I want to talk about three principles in particular. The first one has to do with the nature of the emphasis that is put today on quantity. You know, it seems to me that properly understood, economics as a discipline should concern itself less with how to add to the physical dimension of the economic system, and more with the long-term benefit of the community whose interest the system is ultimately intended to serve. This distinction is really quite fundamental, given what we have learned in the last couple of decades, for instance, about the likely impact of climate change, and the associated environmental disasters. So far, in the last 75 years, the emphasis has been a little too much on adding to the scale of the economy, producing more goods and services, and so on. And what I'm saying is that we need to move to a system in which we need to reframe the debate about what is the meaning of human welfare. Is human welfare simply the accumulation of material goods, or is human welfare something that in fact is much more deep and that involves many other non-material aspects, which if ignored are going to lead to all kinds of instabilities and social dysfunctions, which is I think what is happening in the world today. The founder of the Baha'i faith had something very perceptive, I think, to say about human progress, what you and I might call civilization, right? The onward march of progress, science and technology and education, and the expansion of the frontiers of knowledge, which I think is a good thing. But he said the following: he said, if carried to excess, civilization will prove to be as prolific a source of evil as it has been of good when kept within the bounds of moderation. In other words, to the extent that we persist in this pathway of focus on quantity, producing more goods and services, exploiting more and more the resources of the limited resources of our planet, then we are basically on an unsustainable path, which is going to crash at some point. And I think that is where he refers to, the sources of evil, meaning human suffering, calamity, disasters waiting for us around the corner if we don't change the path and the emphasis. Secondly, economic growth, I think, is a good thing, but it has to be consistent with environmental protection. It has to be consistent with respect for human rights, right? Why is it that we did not think that the Soviet system was sustainable? Because under Stalin, millions of people labored in labor camps, not getting paid, and making thus the Soviet economy very competitive because of cheap labor. We don't want that kind of economic growth because it violates something very fundamental, which is respect for people's dignity and their human rights, right? We want to have economic growth that is consistent with gender equality as well, to turn women in most parts of the world into second-class citizens. Is not something that is socially optimal. On the contrary, it carries with it huge economic costs. We want to have good economic growth that is consistent with good governance, transparency, respect for the rule of law, democratic legitimacy. Yes, it makes a great deal of difference. Respect for cultural diversity. We have countries today, Iran in the 21st century, that actively discriminate and persecute religious minorities, such as the members of the Baha'i community, to give you an example, in ways that are cruel and that are intended to essentially strangulate the economic life of the largest religious minority in the country. And then finally, it seems to me we have to be pragmatic, not ideological. That we have suffered a great deal in the 20th century as a result of economic systems that have essentially tried to protect certain kinds of ideological tenets rather than be focused on whether the policy, the ideology, the system actually led to improvements in human welfare. I spent 4.5 years of my professional life in Russia in the 1990s. I was the representative for the International Monetary Fund during that transition from a centrally planned system and an autocratic system into a market economy and hopefully the emergence of some semblance of democracy. The experiment has had very mixed success, but living in Russia in the 1990s, I saw the extent to which the Soviet Union eventually collapsed because of the emphasis on preserving certain ideological postulates rather than thinking, what makes sense, what is good for the public. The head of the Baha'i community said, I think, something very apt, which describes the situation. He said, legal standards, political and economic theories are designed to safeguard the interests of humanity as a whole, and not humanity to be crucified for the preservation of the integrity of any particular law or doctrine. Too often in the past century, our politicians, our ideologues have been willing to crucify mankind for preserving a particular ideology, rather than asking themselves, what is actually good for the world? And it is a question, what leads to human happiness and human welfare? And I think COVID-19 has shown that perhaps our emphasis has not been appropriate over the last many years. We need to shift gears. We need to rebalance our economy. We need to have growth because growth is the most powerful weapon for bringing people out of poverty, and we have too much poverty in the world. But it has to be growth that is consistent with all the things that I have mentioned, especially the whole question of environmental sustainability. We need to have economic growth that is consistent with a transition from a fossil fuel economy to an economy that uses renewable sources of energy and so on. Let me finish by saying that the solutions are there. We know exactly what are the tools and the instruments that we need to address climate change. What is lacking, unfortunately, is the political will. What is lacking is politicians who are willing to think less about the next election and what is expedient, and to think more about the legacy that they will leave for their children and their grandchildren. And to the extent that governments are more willing to think about the long-term future and less about the next election, then we will have a better chance of moving on to a more sustainable development path. Let me stop here. There is a great deal more that can be said on these issues, obviously, but my half an hour is up, and I wanted to respect the time limit imposed by the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augusto, for that 30-minute talk in which you really tried to highlight, the scale of the problem that we're facing. Gave some very practical solutions, and also tried to highlight some principles that underpin our efforts to try and think of new ways to emerge out of this COVID-19 pandemic with new ways of thinking about, economic aspects of life. So I just wanted to say to our audience, now is the chance for Q&A. You can submit your questions via the Q&A panel in your bottom screen. Already some questions have come through. I'd like to say at the outset that we won't get a chance to do all the questions, so I apologize for that. There'll be a chance for unanswered questions to be answered. I'll try and put questions together, apologies for that, but just so that everyone gets a chance and the interesting questions get to rise to the top. So the first question that I'm kind of seeing is, well, maybe just to, working a bit, is this idea that currently a lot of governments currently are dealing with this immediate crisis of the pandemic, and much of their focus and spending is focused around this. But of course, I guess the question rises, as you're saying, how do we learn from this? How do we, create the resilience needed in order to avert further crises and all these crises that are emerging, climate crises, future pandemics. So the question, I think, is something along the lines of how can governments begin to move out of this crisis mindset in which they're spending maybe in ways that are not sustainable, and try and think about what are the steps in which we can try and emerge out of this in a way and have an economy in which we're resilient against these future problems.
Right. Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you. I think that as you know, in 2020, governments responded in a very massive way to deal with the impact of the crisis. I won't go into a detailed description of the things that were done, but governments were very creative. They basically deployed a whole range of weapons, to deal with the impact of the lockdown. And you have seen many of those in your own country, in the United States, and as well in the rest of the world, because this was a global crisis. And I think that the intention of governments was, let's try to spend to protect, to mitigate the damage, and then we'll worry about the impact on the public finances and on debt levels, in the future, once we're in a period of recovery. And I think that to a great extent that was the correct response, except that I would simply say the following, right? Coming out of the global financial crisis in 2009, we already entered into periods characterized by much higher levels of indebtedness. I'll give you the example of Spain, okay, just to illustrate my point. Spain was one of the well-behaved economies of the European Union. In 2007, its debt levels were 37% of GDP, well below what is called Maastricht criteria, which is 60%. If your debt is below 60% in the European Union jargon used by economists, you're behaving well. You have a very sustainable fiscal outlook. All right, after the global financial crisis of 2009, the Spanish economy was forced to intervene to deal with the crisis, and it ended the decade with levels of about 100% of GDP. Today, as a result of the interventions of 2020, its debt is 120% of GDP. So there has been a tripling of debt levels in Spain over a period of 13 years. That is a problem that they will have to deal with over the next several years. It won't go away. Now, one way to address the issue of debt sustainability is to do reforms now as the economy recovers, that will essentially boost economic growth, boost productivity, and allow the Spanish economy and other economies all over the world, because this feature is common to a great many of the world global economies, to allow them to essentially grow their way out of current very high debt levels. They need to be imaginative. You need to remove obstacles to business creation. You need to encourage entrepreneurship. You need to invest more on education. You need to take advantage of the crisis, essentially, to take your economy to a new level of a new path of growth. Is this going to be done? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. It will, it's an experiment underway. Some countries will do, other countries will not, and many countries, because they will not, they will default. I think we're going to have a huge problem of debt sustainability in many parts, especially the developing world, coming around the corner, and that is going to have to be dealt with. This crisis will have long-term implications on top of processes that were already underway as a result of other factors. Population aging, which is leading to changes in the composition of the labor force and putting burden on pension systems, longer term. That was already in the cards. It's part of our structural feature. COVID-19 is not going to change that. And so on top of those factors, we have, of course, the debt accumulated as a result of the crisis. So we have a tough situation. It's something that is going to require a great deal of care, a great deal of inventiveness, creativity, and competence on the part of government. With your permission, Zinzan, I see that somebody is asking a very simple question, which I can answer in one word. 12.5 billion tons of ice have melted in what period? A 24-hour period, right? August 1st, 2019. That was the time period. I think I did say it. You may have missed it, but now I have clarified. Thank you. Next question.
Thanks a lot. I was just going to make a quick comment. Yeah, if people do have questions that are related to little points or metrics that Augusto mentioned in his talk, we can answer them in a later thing, so we can focus on, I guess, the bigger questions. Another question, which I apologize, I'm trying to put some things together. Many of the questions are coming through relating to, as governments try and understand how to, move out of this. I guess as you were raising in your talk, we have some principles that need to change. Are this, this obsession with economic growth, many of the participants are highlighting, is just not, it's not working, and we need to consider a broader understanding of what does human welfare mean. So I think kind of a two-pronged question. One part is, if we're not using economic growth as a measure of welfare, then what metrics can we turn to, or what can we look at instead? And the second thing is, well, also what, and more broadly, what if the current model of what we understand by economic success and good is, what other models might prove better for, I guess, a more sustainable way in which we do things. So some of the suggestions people were asking about were donuts economics, the degrowth movement. You can choose however much of what I said to answer.
I think that I think that one of the challenges that we face today is the whole question of inequality. You know, our economic systems have coexisted with worsening income distribution trends, and this is very worrying. I come from Latin America, although I haven't lived and worked there for a long, long time. You know, I was born there, and Latin America is perhaps the region of the world with the worst Gini coefficients. Gini, as you know, is a coefficient that captures as a metric of inequality. A high Gini coefficient means high levels of inequality, and Latin America has some of the highest Ginis in the world, and it has ceased to be simply an economic problem, and it has now acquired, you know, very important political dimensions. I think that if you fail to address the issue of inequality, then you risk essentially undermining the basis of your democracy, and you risk dramatic increases in social instability, and essentially, if this problem gets out of hand, essentially your country can become ungovernable, and that is already happening in parts of Latin America. You know, you're seeing more and more populists, demagogues, as I call them, you know, come forward and promise relief, promise nirvana, and of course they cannot deliver. And so 3-4 years later, people are more disappointed, and you get into a kind of a very vicious circle of development. But the problem of inequality has already been very successfully addressed in many countries. The European Union is a good example. The European Union is the region of the world that has the lowest Ginis in the world. I'm not saying that there is no inequality in the European Union. I'm saying that when you compare across regions of the world, the European Union has the lowest levels of inequality throughout the 7 regions that the World Bank divides the world in. And this is deliberate. It's something that has been achieved through transfers in the context of the European Union budgets from the rich countries to the lower income countries. You know, many years ago in my own professional career, I was the IMF economist for Spain at a time when Spain joined the European Union. And I saw the impact that joining the European Union had on the Spanish economy. When it joined, its income per capita was below the average of the European Union. Therefore, it was entitled to receive so-called structural funds. And these were vast sums of money, 5, 6, 7% of GDP, which Spain used to get on an annual basis from Germany, from the Netherlands, you know, from the rich members of the European Union, which then were used to modernize the country, to build up the infrastructures, and to essentially bring the Spanish economy into modernity. And so for me, inequality, the solutions to inequality, how to deal with it are already there. We know, we have the tools, we have the instruments. You can use tax policy as a mechanism for distribution. The Nordics have done it fantastically well. The Nordic countries have the lowest Ginis in the world, and they also happen to be, by the way, the happiest countries in the world. You look at the latest results of the happiness index put out by Jeffrey Sachs and his team. It is no accident. There is a reason for that. When you have equality, when you give people opportunity, when you have a safety net that protects everybody, people tend to be happier. People tend to then worry less about whether they will have money to finance the next meal, and then they tend to focus more on educating themselves, building up their human capital, nurturing relationships within society, civil society, and so on and so forth. So the solutions are there. We need to pay much more attention, and I think we aren't, unfortunately, and that is the reason why you see more and more evidence of the political and social ramifications of inequality. I think that what you saw in the United States in the last 4 years politically is very much a reflection of people feeling that they are left out by the economic system, and that the government doesn't care, that whatever policies are implemented are for the benefit of the well-off and the 1%. And this leads to dissatisfaction, and the backlash is that then they put their faith and their votes on demagogues, on people who don't have the competence and don't have the ability to deliver what is needed.
So yeah, just to maybe build off some of the points you were making there, maybe just to highlight, I guess there's different ways in which we can think about inequality. Like there's, inequality within, or even in cities or within countries, but of course there's also inequality between nations. And some of the questions that are coming through are asking, essentially, well, especially because this pandemic has highlighted it so much, how do we begin to address this inequality between nations and the extreme poverty that we're seeing in certain countries? Because you're talking about the model of like the European Union. So essentially, a question around, how do we begin to address these levels of extreme poverty that are just increasing now because of the pandemic? And does that involve also a strengthening of global institutions?
We have, I mentioned the example of the European Union because I think that we have not given them credit for the achievements of the last several decades in the area of inequality. I have sort of focused a great deal on inequality in my own work in recent years because of the concern I have about the ramifications of the problem remaining unaddressed, but also because there are tools that we have for addressing it. Let me give you an example. I mentioned in my remarks this study that we had done at the World Bank looking at legal barriers, discriminations essentially against women embedded in the laws of countries. It's called the Women, Business and the Law Project, by the way, and you can just type in Google Women, Business and the Law, and it will take you to the website of this particular project. This team was one of the teams in the Global Indicators group when I was its director, and it was my pleasure and satisfaction to actually lead their work and compile this database. But one of the things that we discovered is that when countries eliminate some of these restrictions, or actually let me put it in the negative. For 190 countries, you had countries that had, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, 24, 25 different forms of discrimination. And you had, a handful of countries, 10% of the countries with no discrimination whatsoever, where the law is, squeaky clean, very, very transparent and creating a level playing field for men and women. And then you had every other country in between. What we discovered is that as the number of discriminations against women rises, all kinds of horrible things begin to happen in society. For instance, the school enrollment rate of girls in secondary school relative to boys drops off. In other words, the presence of these restrictions has a discouraging effect on girls. They see themselves, well, what's the point? I'm not going to finish my education. The labor force participation rate of women is much lower relative to that of men. The quantity of women-owned businesses is much less. The wage gap is much larger, between men and women and so on. In other words, the existence of these forms of discrimination, has very dramatic economic impacts. And one of the data points from this study is that income inequality improves in those countries in which women are empowered, in which they face less restrictions, in which they're able to contribute to family income, to go out and work, and so on. So, eliminating and promoting gender equality is actually a very, very powerful instrument, to address the problem of income inequality, right? Not something that is much talked about, but it is a very powerful instrument. And so, for me, again, it's not an issue of absence of knowledge. It's not an issue that we don't know what to do. It's a question of we need to be willing to do it, and we need to press countries to be more proactive in terms of eliminating some of these various forms of discrimination.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for highlighting this need for this. We understand what is needed, but we need to, the government needs to follow through with action and all this. I guess a question to follow on from there is, of course, in one sense, of course, governments and these institutions have a role to play, but what role do individuals and each of us have to play in, trying to not only rethink some of these ways in which we're conceiving of welfare and growth, how do we, what do individuals have a role to play in reconceiving that, and also in actually taking action to, achieve, for example, the United Nations 2030 development goals?
Yeah, I think that we're coming out of an era in which we have tended to look up to government as being essentially the way to solve our problems, right? If you actually look at the early years, the early decades after the United Nations was created, all the initiatives that took place in the area of international cooperation intended to address some kind of problem, were always led by governments. But what happened in the 80s and the 90s, you began to see the emergence of two new actors in the field. One was civil society, individuals, people like you and me, joining forces through the NGO community. And then you also had the business community. And then when you actually look at, what are some of the most important achievements of international cooperation over the last 20 years? Okay, I'll give you 3 or 4 examples that I think are broadly recognized among experts as having been perhaps the most noteworthy. One of them was the Montreal Protocol to address the issue of the ozone layer. Another one was the creation of International Criminal Court, the campaign to ban landmines, the 2017 Treaty on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. Okay, these are sort of towering achievements of international cooperation over the last 20 years. Right? None of these would have happened without the participation of civil society. Governments on their own would not have undertaken these initiatives. It was actually individuals, people like you and me, joining forces, using the latest technologies for networking and communicating, that drafted treaties, and then to address a particular problem, and then approached, well-meaning governments, Canada, Norway, New Zealand, Mexico, a couple of others in Latin America, and said, look, we have this global problem. Here is a draft treaty that has been put in place by us, civil society, people like you and me, without any political power per se. We're not bureaucrats. We are simply concerned citizens. And then these governments took on these initiatives and build up, political support for them. And eventually they led to, these treaties which have addressed, important problems. The ozone layer, which was an existential threat at some point in the 1980s, is no longer a serious problem. It is well on its way to being, addressed as a major concern. And so I think that luckily for us, we're living in an era in which we are empowered by technology, and we have to join forces, and we have to work through civil society groups, to try to take initiatives or put pressure on governments. I was a young economist in the IMF in the 1990s, and I remember at that time there was a very serious problem of external debt of poor countries in Africa, and this NGO community came out. It was called Jubilee 2000. Do you remember? No, many of you probably were too young in the 1990s, but Jubilee 2000 was a community of people like you and me who came together to pressure governments to give debt relief to highly indebted countries in Africa, in Latin America, and in other places, because they thought that without this debt relief, these countries would not be able to grow. They would continue to be mired in poverty and so on. And it was actually the leadership of one of your prime ministers, Gordon Brown, who took on board these proposals, made them his own and the proposals of the UK government, and then began pressuring other countries in the context of the IMF and the World Bank. And this eventually became a global initiative, and it was very successful in reducing the levels of debt, right? But you see, it wouldn't have happened without people like you and me coming together and creating a pressure group to bring a very important problem to the attention of governments. So, and then of course, at a more personal level, you know, we individuals have power. We vote for politicians. We put in power corrupt and incompetent politicians, or we put in power honest, competent, well-educated, well-motivated individuals. It's our choice. That is the virtue of democracy. And in many parts of the world, unfortunately, we voters either don't care, are misinformed, are not exercising our political judgment effectively. And of course, as a result of this, you know, we end up with the kinds of corrupt politicians which we have in many parts of the world today, who are causing great damage to their countries, to the environment, and postponing, you know, prosperity for their people. So we have a great deal of responsibility, and there are many things that we can do.
Thank you very much, Augusto. I'm just conscious that we're coming up to 9 p.m. and it's really just so sad that we can't be able to answer all these fantastic questions that the audience is answering. But I think we're gonna maybe slowly have to wrap it up there. But just to say a very big thank you to you, Augusto, for giving your talk and for answering those questions very eloquently. It gave us a lot of hope, I feel, about the possibilities that are emerging out of this crisis, and not just possibilities for governments, but also possibilities for each of us to think about the role that we can play in trying to reshape and re-envision the way in which we perceive of human welfare. Just to say thank you to the audience for asking all your questions. Those questions that were unanswered, we'll be posting a statement. I think Augusto will help write a little statement trying to answer maybe some of these questions that were unanswered on our Facebook page. We'll put a link to the Facebook page just to know, and we'll get the slide up. And just to say, just at the very end, I'd just like to say that there's some more talks coming up, which you may be interested in if you enjoyed today's talk. So if you could have the slide with the talks on. So tomorrow there'll be a talk on new perspectives on justice. This is hosted again by the Baha'i Society. This is a talk by Leili Miller-Muro, who's the head of the Tahrir Justice Center. So that's tomorrow, 7:30. There's a QR code if you want to scan it. There's still a chance to register for that. I'll just give you a chance to take a picture of that. And the second event that's also happening, if you go to the next slide, is a post-festival discussion. So obviously these are talks, but this is just a chance to explore a bit more deeply some of the themes that are raised in this talk and trying to go a bit further about what action that we can take as individuals. And that's happening on this Friday at 7:30. And again, there's a QR code. Just if you want to know more about our future events, there's our Facebook page, Cambridge University Baha'i Society. And of course, if you do have any more questions or more things you'd like to ask us, again, go to our Facebook page. But all in all, thank you very, very much to all our audience members, and especially thank you very much to Augusto. We hope you enjoyed the talk, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.